Now, a special presentation of KRDO News Channel 13, where the news comes first. A community conversation.
And good evening, and thank you for joining us for this special presentation from KRDO News Channel 13. For the next 45 minutes, we will be hosting a live community conversation in response to the violence and racial tensions that have erupted across the country. We are hosting this conversation, obviously on TV, on KRDO News Radio, and also KRDO.com. My colleague James Jarman will be moderating the debate online, taking your questions. We also have a panel of guests here to talk about the issues that are now grabbing the nation's attention. I am joined by El Paso County Commissioner Sally Clark. We also have former El Paso County Sheriff John Anderson here. He was sheriff from 1995 to 2003. We also have Reverend Dr. Margaret Redman from First AME Church in Pueblo. And thank you all for coming this evening. We really appreciate to join in this conversation and hopefully tackle some of these issues that are now facing us as a nation and also as a community. And for those of you watching, we also invite you to log on to KRDO.com and click on to our community conversation top story. Take part in what we hope will be a useful and civil dialogue here. And to frame this beginning from the important conversation, here are some of the voices we've heard this week from communities in Dallas, Minneapolis, and Baton Rouge.
The individuals involved in his murder took away a man with children who depended upon their daddy on a daily basis.
Today is not only about justice and getting justice, but it's about all of the families that have lost people. This thing that has happened in Dallas, it was not because of something that transpired in Minnesota today. This is bigger than Philando. This is bigger than Trayvon Martin. This is bigger than Sandra Bland. This is bigger than all of us. So today, I just want justice for everyone.
The past 24 hours in Dallas has been a veritable tale of two cities. On the one hand has been the tale of heroism of police officers. At the same time, it's been a tale of cowardice by an assassin.
And there you hear some of the voices, the very emotional voices that have been speaking leading up to what happened in the culmination last night of what we saw in Dallas, 5 police officers killed. I want to say, as a bit of housekeeping, we are tracking severe weather here in southern Colorado. If we need to break into this conversation here, please give us grace to do so. Obviously, Storm Tracker 13 Chief Meteorologist Rachel Plath is tracking all the very latest severe weather tonight. So do bear with us as we try and juggle a bunch of different issues tonight. We have learned that President Obama will cut short his trip to Europe this week. He will go to Dallas here in the coming days to deal with this, to talk with community members. Glad to see that from a national perspective. I want to hear from each one of you. If you could give me a quick synopsis, a paragraph if you could, summarizing what we are facing, why this is at such a boiling point across the nation and also here in our own backyard. What in your perspective is going on? What is the litmus here? Sally, do you want to start?
Well, you know, I think that the counties stand steadfast behind peaceful demonstrations, between freedom of speech, between making sure that folks are heard and their voices are heard. But we also don't condone the violence that's happening in our communities across the United States. And I think that it's important for us to send our thoughts and prayers to the families of all those who have lost their lives, no matter whether they're civilians or whether they're our police officers. This type of violence really, it brings it obviously to a level that makes all of us feel that something needs to be done. But we really encourage folks to come to the table. And I think in this community, we have worked very hard to make sure that those voices are heard. But things can happen and people do evil things. And not knowing all the facts about how this all happened in Dallas, I think it's important for us to just really stand with those who have lost their lives and their families, as well as those who have been injured civilians and police officers together.
And John Anderson.
I think what we're seeing is something similar to what communities and leaders felt in the 1960s with civil unrest, when we reached this crescendo of events that we could just no longer tolerate. And I think what's important, this is why I'm here tonight, is to engage in that dialogue with our community. I'm not in law enforcement anymore. I've retired after 30 years in law enforcement, so I can't speak for any of the agencies, but I thought the leaders at the local level, Chief Carey and our police chief and our mayor, all responded very effectively today collectively. And I think we're very fortunate to have some very forward-thinking leaders. I was blessed in my 30 years in law enforcement to work for 5 forward-thinking visionary police chiefs, and 2 of them, Jim Munger and Lauren Kramer, I remember them emphasizing the point that you don't police a community, you police with a community. And I think that's one of the things that we're seeing missing in many of these communities that are involved. The community doesn't seem to be engaged in policing, and we need to address that. We need a diverse workforce that's reflective of that community.
And Margaret, what is your take on what exactly is happening right here? What has led us to this point?
Well, thank you very much for having me, first of all. But I think one of the things that we're seeing is we saw the outpouring of concern for the 5 officers who were slain yesterday. And we do lament with them, but since 2011, anywhere between 283 and 500 unarmed African Americans have been killed. And for the Black Lives Matter movement, they're not saying that all lives don't matter. Of course, every life is valuable to God. But right now, what we're feeling in our communities is that our lives matter less. So in Pueblo, what we're doing is we have a very robust relationship with law enforcement, from the public defenders, the chief of police, the sheriff, as well as the district attorney. We all have each other's business cards. So when and if something happens in Pueblo, there's a group that is ready to respond to it, and we can work toward making a solution.
I like your summarizations of what is going on and what has led us to this point. We want to look back, though. We've had violence erupt in Ferguson, Missouri, New York, Baltimore, Chicago, Cleveland, Tulsa, South Carolina, which has brought about this movement of the Black Lives Matter. And certainly, as you said, Margaret, it's not just Black Lives Matter, all lives matter here. And yet, in this public discourse of what has been going on, we see some disconnect. John, you made mention of that it's hard to police when we don't have a community that is detached necessarily. So how do we make that bridge come together? How do we bridge those in the public and in the sphere of law enforcement? How do we make sure that that is seen together in a good way, a healthy way?
I'll take first shot at that, and I think it's not up to just the law enforcement representatives to get out and recruit. I think there's a different statement if I walk into a black church asking for people to consider law enforcement as a profession, as opposed to Reverend Redmond. And I think we need representatives from all of our diverse communities engaged actively in the recruiting process, the selection process, the promotional processes. And it shouldn't be just racially equality, it should be gender equality that we're after as well.
I agree with you 100% that we do need to recruit differently than we have in the past. One of the problems that I've heard with law enforcement being unable to recruit African American men and women, some of us are suspicious of law enforcement. We've had some unpleasant experiences. That's first and foremost, but second of all, the criteria. How many of our African American men have been incarcerated? I mean, I think back to the 70s when the war on drugs, 3 strikes you're out, caused so many of our men to be incarcerated. So now we don't have people who are qualified, who meet the criteria. I would imagine that they're qualified if they've done their service, paid their debt to society, and they're now productive members of the community. But I think there has to be some conversation around hearing our story. Sometimes the African American community feels that the story isn't heard. We sit down at the table and we talk, and we get talked over by people saying, well, then perhaps we should do something different. We should not resist arrest. Well, we didn't resist arrest. Sandra Bland was a member of the AME Church. As a pastor of an AME church, we lamented when Charleston happened. We are a forgiving people, but we would like to see the same response from the rest of the community. We all know that we all don't have the same level playing field. We acknowledge that, but we're working to make a difference in changing that.
And how do you do that within your church, Doctor? How are you addressing that? Are you doing that at all from the pulpit? Are you telling today's youth, hey, this is what could happen. This is what we're seeing playing out in some parts of the nation. How are you addressing that within your congregation?
Well, the first thing I think that a lot of times what I see in the congregation are people who don't feel valued and loved. So of course I preach that God's love is available to all. And then I talk to them about, here's what you do when, I have a son. I've had to talk with him about what to do when police stop him. But I've also had to talk with him to say that this does not define who you are. What other people think of you is not who God created you to be. What you think of you. And I think we are at a point now where Black Lives Matter in particular, they have, unfortunately, and I think it's in all churches, that the church doesn't have the sway over our young people as we used to. But that may not necessarily be a bad thing. There are organizations out there who are catching on to what it is that they need, and they're teaching them. So it's a community effort. It's not just the church.
Mm-hmm. Do you know of other parents as well who might have children and who are teaching them, training them, you must act in this way, not this way? Is that a conversation that you've had?
Absolutely. Just about every African American family has that talk with their sons especially. And now we're seeing we have to have it with our daughters as well. And they don't get it. There's a disconnect for them because they think that all is equal now because the Civil Rights Act happened in the 1960s. And as they come of age, they start to learn that that's not necessarily the case. But we still instruct them that it is not your job to be judge, jury, and executioner.
Mm-hmm. And that's the other side of this conversation, is that there has to be mutual respect here.
Yes.
There has to be a recognition that we are all valued in God's eyes. Mm-hmm. There is no one who is greater or less. We are all equal. Mm-hmm. And so that parlays to law enforcement as well, that, and you touched on this, Doctor, that you cannot be judge, jury, executioner. This goes to the 5 officers who were slain last night as well, that they were standing up for the right to free speech, the right to protest against what their profession says they should do. So how do we turn that over without neglecting one side or the other? How do we have this conversation then, therefore, and say, okay, we have to be careful. We can't just assume, as you just mentioned, Doctor, that we can't just assume because civil rights are on an equal playing level that people will act in that way, and therefore it is not your responsibility to go against the law officers that we have here in our nation who are standing to protect.
Well, you know what? 99.9% of our law enforcement are truly protecting and serving. But there's always that 1%, that rogue cop that does something and then they don't get punished for it. Of the 200 and something, I think that was the last count I saw since 9/11, of the 283, less than 10 have been disciplined. And 283 African Americans stopped by cops and killed. I don't know that African American community. And I don't think it's accurate. It's not a portrayal of who we are.
John, you wanted to say something?
I did. I want to respectfully respond to 2 points. One, in agreement, I think you bring up an interesting point. And maybe we need to look at the standards of recruitment and selection with all of our candidates, not just African American, who've already served time or have been arrested. And this is the respectful part that I want to try to insert, because when I was the sheriff, I had an average daily population of about 1,200 inmates. I also had an open door policy with the black ministers. And when the black ministers showed up at the front lobby, everything else stopped. Their voice was going to be heard. And when they would walk in and say, listen, your jail population is disproportional to our community. We have an 8% or whatever it was at the time, maybe 9% African American community, but your jail is incarcerating 26% African American right now. And I said, you're absolutely right. I'm so glad that you're here. And here's the disproportionality. 90% of those crimes that those African males committed were on were interracial crimes. And the biggest discriminator is within those communities. Same way with the Hispanic community. If there's a disproportionality, many of those crimes happen within that community. But the biggest discriminator is the economy, is poverty. And I think that goes back to education. So when we see a higher dropout rate of African American or Hispanic people, that means they're going to have fewer job opportunities, and that's going to relate to domestic violence and other concerns. So I think it starts with schools, and I think that's if we can bring equality to our economy with people regardless of gender, then I think that's a great place to start, and starts in our schools.
You make some really good points. If you could hold your point there, Doctor. We do want to toss it out to James Jarman, who has been monitoring the feedback that we're getting online from our community. James, what are you hearing out there?
Yeah, we're getting a lot of comments here, Heather, and a couple of people here wondering about the police cameras. One person saying that nobody believed them when they complained about police behavior until now, when everybody has cameras out. Now they're believing that police have been misbehaving, is what they're talking about, is how they worded it. Another says, why is there such a delay in the Colorado Springs police officers getting body cameras? I think the update on that one, by the way, is they will get those cameras in October. And perhaps, Heather, we can toss this one out to our panel. This one from Karen Grant. She says, how as a community can we come together and understand how we can bridge the gap between African Americans and police officers? African American parents have to talk to their kids about how to act in case you get pulled over. Why should parents have to do this?
And that is a good question. Maybe, Doctor, you can address that one.
Well, we want our children to grow up. That's the bottom line. We want our children to grow up. And you know, I think about Tamir Rice. He was in the park with a toy gun, and he was shot within 2 seconds of the police arriving. I had to have a talk with my son. His dad had to have a talk with him saying...
And what did you say? What did you say to your son?
I can't say it on TV. But I stressed to him the importance of knowing your surroundings, never being somewhere alone where something like this could happen to you. And if a policeman stops you, you do as they ask, nothing more, nothing less. So, and that doesn't always save the day.
You know, if I might, I think that applies to anyone, not just the black community, but to anyone educating their kids about interaction with law enforcement. And one of the things I wanted to mention from a national perspective that county commissioners and supervisors have been working on nationally with sheriffs and district attorneys and the judicial system is working to reauthorize the Second Chance Act to look at different ways to incarcerate people, and when they are sent to jail, to figure out a way that they can get back out and be productive in society, and whether that's working on pretrial services programs that keep them out of jail in the first place. Because once there's that black mark, I think that mark on someone's record that they have a criminal record, it's much harder to get a job. And we are at a national level with county commissioners and counties nationwide working on figuring out how to be more effective keeping the bad people in jail that need to be there, but also finding alternatives to incarceration, the community corrections plans that help them to get jobs and be productive members of society and have a future in life, to expunge records if they're not necessary, and to look at especially our younger folks who end up in jail because of one bad decision that isn't really a risk to society, and then keeping that on their record forever, which really precludes them from being successful as an adult.
It's amazing what involved parents can do for the next generation. And that's really, if we're talking about a grassroots effort, it really does come back to parents being involved and speaking truth into their child's life, does it not? That way we can avoid, hopefully, any of this. I mean, we can save lives in that respect. I want to go back to a very constructive community conversation that happened earlier today here in Colorado Springs involving a lot of elected leaders. Our own KRDO News Channel 13's Colleen Sikora was there. She brings us this story.
They don't understand what hundreds of years of oppression can do.
Joe Harmon is talking about the white population, but he says retaliation isn't the answer.
I really get it why people are so upset, people that don't have a voice, and they've been discriminated against for 250 years.
Harmon asked Henry Allen with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference to help white people understand what blacks are going through.
I struggle with that internally. I don't want to see people get hurt, but I empathize with people that don't have a voice.
Members of the community also expressed that it comes down to needing to understand one another. Orion Florney is a pastor at a local Baptist church. He responded to Harmon as well and fears people are stereotyping the black community as angry and ignorant.
We are loving folks, we are respectable folks.
He believes the issues stem from both sides.
Shame on the police officers that carried out their part of it. Shame on the young man that carried out his part.
Sadness expressed on the panel of leaders.
There was some wet ice today in my department as I talked to my young officers.
They put their lives on the line every day and are prepared to lose them.
All calling for change here in Southern Colorado.
From the law enforcement perspective, you set very high standards for your law enforcement departments, and you recruit people to those standards.
In a few weeks, the Colorado Springs Police Department is going to step up with body-worn cameras for our police officers. By October, everybody in uniform will have a camera.
And you just heard Police Chief Pete Carey there say that body cams will be worn by every uniformed officer with Colorado Springs Police, increasing the transparency there. We've heard it earlier said, and even in this broadcast, said that these instances of violence have already existed. It's just that they weren't documented. And the power of even a cell phone, of video documenting evidence of violence, I do believe can institute some respects of change. And I want to also go back to the fact that even yesterday, we had 43 officers sworn in with Colorado Springs Police. Diverse force. Mayor Suthers spoke to that earlier today in the fact that, we're hiring a bunch of different people with different backgrounds, which contributes to that dialogue and contributes to that reinforcement of we are all equal, we are here to keep the peace, right? And John Anderson, you're here joining us as well. You've got law enforcement in your background. You spoke to the importance of that, of having a diverse force that reinforces this concept of we are not here to enforce the law on one particular segment of the population, correct?
Right. Policing isn't something you do to a community, it's something you do with a community. And I had the privilege of being invited to attend yesterday's graduation from one of the 43 recruits, and I asked him and some of his classmates about how they felt being the first class that was issued cameras from the beginning of their careers, and without exceptions, the ones I talked to welcomed it. They thought it was a good change. This was the 65th Police Academy Colorado Springs has graduated. Put that in perspective, Lou Velez, the chief, and Pueblo and I were in the second class together in 1975. So a lot of change that's gone by. But I think what this community will see with the officers that are wearing the body cams, the professionalism and the compassion and the caring that we really have of the community. Real quickly, back to Reverend Redmond. One point she did bring out that's very valid is when we see these instances escalate quickly, like we've seen on some of the cameras from people, that's usually not the first incident that officer's been involved in. And I worked internal affairs with the police department. Of course, I oversaw it at the sheriff's office. And there's usually a downward spiral that starts with these officers, that when you start profiling the officer, you'll see some very aggressive behavior. So one of the things that's been implemented in many departments is this rapid identification and early incapacitation, where we're looking at them early and saying, you fit this profile, and there's going to be a dramatic change, or you're going to be finding another place to work because it won't be here.
So let's zero in on that a little bit. It takes the awareness of not only the higher levels, like the chief of police or even the sheriff, but it takes those who, maybe that particular person who might have a pre-existing bent, it takes those alongside being aware and recognizing, hey, I've observed some behavior with you. Can we talk about this? How would that play out, say, on the line?
And it's entirely different than it was 40 years ago when I started, because I think you could arguably say, that thin blue line, existed. You don't, rat on a fellow officer. That's absolutely the opposite now. Because if you're an officer and you see unlawful behavior, wrong behavior, aggressive behavior, and you don't take action, then you're going to be held responsible too. And departing from the truth is one thing in the sheriff's office as well as the police department here. That's absolutely intolerated. Not tolerated. People who depart from the truth are going to be more quickly separated from the organization than someone who's acted out wrongly.
So if you could say something to the men and women who are in uniform, how would you put that in a nutshell to them?
What a great question, Heather. And I wish I'd have thought this through, but I'd say don't let this shake your integrity, your foundation, the reason you wanted to be in uniform, the reason why you wanted to serve this community. Embrace this community, embrace this opportunity to bring about change. Don't shy away from it.
Right now, we want to go out to James Jarman, who has been monitoring the public discourse of this in the wake of the Dallas shootings, and even before that, the 2 black men who were shot this last week in Minneapolis and also Baton Rouge. And James, you do have a guest with you now.
Yeah, Heather, I'm joined here with Kamau Wassid. He's a student activist with Howard University in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for joining us. What is it that the younger generation of African-American college students, what is it, the message that they want told?
Well, we want justice. And you see, the thing is, my generation was raised on the shoulders of civil rights giants. We were raised to look at the accomplishments of the civil rights movement and to look at the bitter struggle that our parents and grandparents had to go through. And that it shocks us that as millennials today, that in this country in 2016, we are still not receiving racial justice. And that's what we want most. We want racial justice, especially in the criminal justice system, economic justice as well. We want this country to really put a stronger value on black lives that has not been placed. And we want this country to live up to the meaning of its creed, that when it talks about justice, equality, and equity, that we actually want those things, and we don't want those things on paper, we want them in practice.
And what is your response when you hear people say, well, the black people who were shot by the white officers, there's more to that story in many of these cases. What do you say to them?
There's always more to a story. There's always more to a story. But where an injustice lies outside of the injustice that takes place is possibly rationalizing ways, in whatever creative way a person can imagine, that a person deserves for their life to be taken. People have rationalized and interpreted different meanings and different body movements to mean something that they possibly could have meant otherwise. And this is very easy to do when the other side of the story is dead. People will say, oh, there's always another side to the story, but what's really critical is to determine what is an injustice and what is not. And what we see taking place today is gravely an injustice.
What do you say about the sniper who shot the officers last night?
In what regard? particularly.
Well, what was your response when you realized what had happened?
Tragic. It was absolutely tragic. It is, in any instance where you see a human being's life taken from them, and again, this is a situation where we try not to talk about the other side of the story because we understand an injustice when we see one. And when we look at what has happened in Dallas, my heart was torn. It's shattered. To look at this and to see officers who are family members, who are fathers, brothers, uncles, it's a tragedy. It's a shame, and it's not the way that justice is to be pursued.
The shooter said that he did this because of the shootings, the white officers who shot the black men. What is your response to that? I mean, is that obviously the sniper was clearly wrong? Mm-hmm. However, is there a part of you that can understand his frustration?
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about that.
Again, I don't condone his actions at all. At all. But we have to understand that this did not come out of thin air. That he admitted over the phone that this was his personal reaction, not the Black Lives Matter movement's reaction, but his personal reaction to witnessing over and over and over again black victims of police shootings, and to go through the entire process. And we know what that process is. And usually in news networks is, they say an unarmed black suspect was killed by a police officer, and then protests will spur up, and a grand jury decision might not even indict the officer for crimes that we feel were gravely unjust. And to watch over and over again the lives that are taken at the hands of people who are paid by our tax money to protect and serve us, and to watch the grave inequity in how policing is done in our communities versus other communities. His anger came from a place that really needs to be dealt with in this country, that if it is not, justice needs to be pursued.
So how do you take that anger and that frustration that you can empathize with and make something positive? How do we move forward, everyone? How does everyone move forward?
Well, first we have to talk about it. We have to talk about it. The first thing that people try to do is to suggest that we should move our emotions to the side, and that's not the case. Our emotions need to be right here on the table. We need to put everything on the table. We need to have all of our animosities and anxieties about what has been happening, all the ugliness of the racism in this country that actually exists, all of the hidden truths that we've been sweeping under the rug. We need to put that right on the table, and now is the perfect opportunity to do so. We need to have an open and robust conversation about not just what has happened, but what continues to happen. And I've noticed that this conversation has really broadened itself in the last 2 years, where 2 years people were more likely to say that racism isn't here, and there are always people who deny it. But now the conversation is really developing, and conversation always leads to change. It leads to policy change. It leads to the way that we think about our culture as a society. It leads to different ways of putting value on human beings' lives. And so that's the first thing that we need to do, is have a robust conversation about this.
What are you and the next generation seeing as we move forward? What do you plan to do?
By seeing, you mean what we hope for?
As you look into the future, what do you see?
A bitter fight, a struggle, to be honest. This is a hard fight. This is a very hard fight, and of course, as an activist, I always have to have a certain amount of optimism, and I am very optimistic. But what I see in the upcoming years, and possibly my children's generation, is the same fight. This is the same fight that my parents have given me. It's the same fight that their parents have given them, and their parents before them. That as black people in this country, one of the biggest things we inherit, if we don't inherit funds, if we don't inherit houses or other forms of property, we inherit a struggle. And it's a very sad reality in this country that whole generations of people have to fight every single generation. That my mother fought in the Black Power movement. My father was born in the Jim Crow South. His father before him was born in Mississippi. The father before him was a sharecropper, and his grandfather was a slave. That what I see in the near future is a conversation that needs to develop around race, that needs to develop around this political and cultural idea that was developed to divide and to destroy whole lives. That I worry for my kids, and I don't even have kids yet. I'm 21 years old and I'm already worried for them. We have to understand that this is a grave problem in this country, but what I see in this future is a continued fight, a fight not against white people, but a fight against a system that continues to value white people over all other lives. A fight that says that you will not incarcerate 1/3 of a generation of men who look like me. A fight that continues to look at the fact that we are 14 times more likely to die of homicide than any other group in this country, and it's a bitter fight, and it's going to continue.
What do we, as white people, need to do?
I want you to care. There are too many that do not care. They say they care and they will chant all lives matter to shout down the voices that are advocating for the rights, the needed rights of black people. There are white people in this country who are not aware of these problems, but are so passionate about shutting people down who do talk about these problems. And this is what Jesse Williams was talking about on BET. He said, if you do not care to advocate for black lives, then do not make suggestions for those who do. The apathy in this country is so devastating. Most people believe that racism floats on hatred, and that's not the case. Racism floats on fear and indifference. Fear about certain communities and an indifference about how we handle those communities. That white people have to understand that this is a problem worth caring about, and it affects their lives too. That the war on drugs, which mostly discriminated against black communities, that militarized police forces, that opened up prison doors and shut down schools, that affect white people indirectly. That white people now have to also face militarized police whenever they're protesting, that billions of dollars of their tax money go to incarcerating black men, and that this is a problem that affects their lives too. Racism comes at a very high price. So white people have to care.
All right, Mara, thanks so much. By the way, if you would like to join in the conversation, you can go to KRDO.com. We have the link there. We're moderating this conversation right now, and some of your questions we will read on the air to give to the panel to have a discussion. Heather, we'll send it back to you.
All right, very well spoken, Mr. Allen. Thank you so much for joining us. And again, I want to turn the focus now to the cops, the members of the law enforcement force that go out on a day in and day out basis and know that they could very well be shot and killed. And knowing very well that they would stand in front of someone just to protect them. Can we talk about those members of law enforcement now and turn the focus on them and say, okay, your lives matter as well. Your lives matter as well. Obviously, the lone gunman last night in Dallas, Micah Johnson, former Army reservist, they found bomb-making materials in his home, firearms, ballistic vests, a journal of combat tactics. He knew what he was doing. He had been trained. You're looking at a picture now of the 5 officers who were killed last night in Dallas. But back to Micah Johnson, he had been deployed to Afghanistan. At some point, he was involved in the Black Panther movement. He said that he wanted to kill white people, especially white police officers. Could those signs have been seen before this even erupted? John, you made mention of the other brothers in arms that might have been serving with him. Could we have seen signs? Could we have had a dialogue before it came to this last night?
That's really a good question that needs to be asked. Is there profilable behavior traits that could have made an early identification on him and that behavior? And unfortunately, a lot of times, unless that leads to illegal action or behavior, then there's not a law enforcement action that can be taken. But I think Kamau made a really important observation, and I wrote this down on fear and indifference. And when I look at some of the videotapes of some of the officers that immediately go to a deadly force, I wonder if there's not fear that's involved with those officers, fear of being hurt, of not handling the situation, and perhaps that does go back to training. And I think that fear and indifference sometimes leads to their only recourse is going to a deadly weapon. And again, where we're very fortunate here is the alternate, less than deadly use of force with the tasers and other non-lethal devices that we're using here.
And it does reinforce the idea that, okay, in training, are we going to look at de-escalation techniques as opposed to resorting to deadly force first? And if so, how can we expand that training? Is that something that we need to look at closer with our various departments here, so that is the first response? Now, I know in law enforcement, you know, if you feel that threat, you're trained to shoot. So is there a point in training where we can backstop that, where we can not every instance can we have a dialogue? I recognize that. And this is in no way meant to slight the members who are out there day in and day out. I want to make that clear. But is there a way we can spearhead that very quickly?
Training is definitely part of that continuum that needs to be addressed, as does the selection, the recruitment. You know, it's the entire continuum of your force management, from selecting people very early on, deselecting those that might have a tendency to be over-aggressive.
If I might too, talking about whether we could have prevented it, we don't know the answer. We don't know what the trigger was, what his background was. But I think the fact that we've looked more at the mental health issues that we're dealing with in our country right now, in terms of not putting enough into the mental health, not getting to the beginning of.
I've got to cut you off, but yes, continue the dialogue online, krdo.com. Thanks for joining us.